So tonight we're going to talk about how to actually interpret and give the limitations for the correlation studies. On the midterm, there's a correlation study example that you need to interpret and give the limitations for. And also for your midterm bonus, you need to do your own correlational study and provide the interpretation and the limitations. So let's talk about the interpretation first. So remember, the exposure is always on the x-axis and the outcome is always on the y-axis. So when you're doing your bonus, make sure that your graph is like that. And then when we interpret it, the first thing we want to say is whether or not we see a positive or negative or no correlation. So you just want to see if, say, between the exposure and the outcome, if you see a positive, negative, or no correlation. That's your first sentence. And then the second sentence for your interpretation is that population-based interpretation. So you want to make sure that you're not talking about individuals, because remember, this is all based on aggregate population-based information. So you would say in population, country, city, state, with a either higher or lower, whatever your exposure is, there is also increased or decreased level of the outcome. So in our example from the lecture that you heard already, we would say in countries with higher rates or higher per capita rates of red meat consumption, there is also an increased level of or increased rate of colon cancer. So and we saw a positive correlation between meat consumption, red meat consumption, and colon cancer. So those are the two parts of your interpretation. We see a positive correlation between meat consumption and colon cancer, and in countries with a higher per capita rate of red meat consumption, there is also an increased level or rate of colon cancer. The next thing we want to do is talk about our limitations. So the first limitation is really about not having information collected on the individuals. In that example, it was all country-based aggregate information, and we actually didn't know if the people who ate meat were the ones who got colon cancer. We also don't know if the exposure, in that case meat consumption, might really be a marker for something else. And the way you would say something like that is perhaps meat consumption is also associated with smoking. People who eat a lot of red meat also smoke, and smoking is really what's causing the colon cancer. And finally, we would say anything other than a simple linear association between red meat consumption and colon cancer is not obvious. So let's look at a couple of examples and write out the interpretation and limitations. So here we have an example with the percentage of adults who get sufficient sleep, and each dot represents a state because this was pulled from CDC Wonder. And on the y-axis, we have death due to malignant neoplasm of the breast. So the first thing we want to think about is whether we see a positive or a negative correlation. And here we're seeing a negative correlation. So we would say there is a negative correlation between percent adults with sufficient sleep and death due to malignant neoplasm of the breast. And then we want to go back and look at our graph again, and for our second part of the interpretation, we would say in states with a higher rate of adults who get sufficient sleep, there is a lower rate of death due to malignant neoplasm of the breast. So in states with a higher percentage of adults with sufficient sleep, there is also a lower rate of death due to malignant neoplasm of the breast. And that is our interpretation. And then the next thing that we want to do is talk about our limitations. So our first limitation is about not having information about the individual. So here we would say we do not know if those that got sufficient sleep are the ones who were protected from malignant neoplasm of the breast. And we phrase it that way because this was a negative correlation, and we were actually seeing a protective effect where the higher the percentage of adults who got sleep, the lower the rate of death due to malignant neoplasm of the breast. So that's why we are phrasing it that way. Then we want to go back to our second limitation and think about how getting sufficient sleep might be a marker for something else. So we want to think about what a marker that might make sense would be. And we'd say perhaps getting sufficient sleep is a marker for a good diet, and the good diet is what is causing the protective effect against malignant neoplasm of the breast. And then finally, we'd want to say something about any association besides linear not being obvious. Any association besides linear between sufficient sleep and malignant neoplasm of the breast is not obvious. So these are all the sentences that you need to do for both your interpretation and your limitation. So remember, the interpretation is two-part. First, whether you're seeing the negative, positive, or no correlation, and then a sentence really describing what that means. And your sentence really needs to be population-based. You don't want to say adults who get more sleep don't die from malignant neoplasm of the breast. That implies an individual relationship, and it's really just that population level relationship that we can see from this type of study. And then finally, each of your three limitations that you want to talk about. So let's do another one. Here we have the percentage of high computer use among high school students as our exposure on the x-axis, and the percentage of students who are obese on the y-axis. So first we want to say if we're seeing a positive or negative correlation. So here there is a positive correlation between percent of students with high computer use and the percent of students who are obese. And our second part would be in states with a higher percentage of students with high computer usage, there is also a higher rate of obesity in those students. So that would be our interpretation, two parts. And then we want to talk about our limitations. And for our limitations, we just go back to our slides about limitations. So our first one is no information collected on the individual. Second, we don't know if the exposure is a marker for something else. And the third one, anything besides linear not obvious. So here, for our first one, we would say we do not know if students with high computer usage are the students who are obese. For our second one, about the exposure being a marker for something else, perhaps high computer usage is a marker for, let's say, no physical activity. And it is no physical activity that is causing higher percentage of obesity. And then finally, we'd say any relationship between high computer usage and percent obesity besides linear is not obvious. And let's just do one more quick example. And remember, please don't use any of these examples for your own correlation study. Here we have a graph, again, from CDC Wonder, looking at states. Each dot is a state. And on the x-axis, we've got the percentage of adults with no leisure activity. And on the y-axis, our outcome, we have the rate of diabetes. So here we're seeing a positive correlation. So there is a positive correlation between percent of adults with no leisure activity and rate of diabetes. In states with a higher percentage of adults with no leisure activity, there is also a higher rate of diabetes. And then we want to go on to our limitations. So let's do that one quickly. So for our limitations, first, no info about the individual. We do not know if the individuals with no leisure activity are the ones with diabetes. And then the exposure might be a marker for something else. So perhaps no leisure activity is a marker for, let's say, eating a high sugar content diet. And the high sugar content diet is what's causing diabetes, or increasing the rate of diabetes. And then finally, any relationship besides linear between no leisure activity and diabetes is not obvious. So those are our three examples. It's all pretty straightforward. Just make sure that you've got your two-part interpretation, one, whether it's a positive, negative, or no correlation, and then you state what that means in words, making sure you're taking a population-based approach with your interpretation, nothing about individuals. And then finally, your limitations. The first one about no information about the individuals. The second one about the exposure being a marker for something else. And the third one about any relationship besides linear not being obvious. Just make sure you spell them out all very specifically for that study. Pretty straightforward and simple. Apologies for not having the live webinar, but we would have walked through this together. It would have taken a little bit more time, but I will post this slide deck as well, so you've got examples of exactly how to do the interpretations and limitations. Thanks, and don't forget to post your questions about the midterm review, what types of problems you want to see during the webinar for the midterm review, so that I can prepare some examples of those. Have a great week, everyone.